Single mom drops tray when she sees her ex-husband. Mafia boss said, "Go to my car. I'll handle." I pressed the phone into the pocket of my apron for the third time that evening. The same old name still being hunted. 217 missed calls in the span of 7 days. And I had once thought I had run far enough. But as it turns out, there is no such thing as far enough. Outside the window of Juno's restaurant, the rain came down in relentless torrents, thick sheets pouring from the sky as if the heavens themselves were bearing the weight of a sorrow I had spent years trying to bury. I forced myself to keep moving, as if everything were still normal, offering strained smiles to customers, carrying trays of food from one table to the next, performing the silent role of a nameless server. But inside, every cell in my body trembled beyond control. Then I saw him, standing there in the rain, beneath the dull, blurred streetlight, his figure motionless, his eyes locked onto mine through the misted glass. I froze. My entire body seized up as though it had been turned to stone. The tray slipped from my hand and crashed onto the marble floor, the shrill crack of shattered porcelain and metal tearing through the quiet hum of the restaurant. Conversation ceased. Every gaze turned toward me. From table 9, the VIP table tucked into the farthest corner of the room, a man rose slowly. He didn't glance at the broken plates, didn't flinch at the noise, didn't even frown, and he didn't look at me. His eyes looked through me, fixed on the door, where the danger waited in the shadows and cold rain. His voice was low and steady, not loud but clear enough to still the entire room. I heard him say, calm and certain, "I'll take care of the rest." I didn't know why I obeyed him. Maybe it was his eyes, sharp as steel forged over years of hardship, and yet not hollow. Or maybe because in that moment, for the first time in months, I no longer felt alone. I turned away, avoiding the curious stares, pushed open the door and stepped straight into the rain, falling hard and fast like 1,000 stinging slaps. Wind lashed my face, my hair whipped wild, soaked through within seconds. A black Audi was parked tightly against the curb. Its headlights cast a soft glow onto the rain-drenched pavement, as if it too held a quiet piece of calm in the midst of chaos. The car door opened. It was him. He didn't need to say it again. I climbed in, my whole body shaking from the cold and the fear, and sat down in the passenger seat. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought it might rip through my chest. I wasn't only afraid of the man outside, I was afraid of the things I didn't yet understand. Afraid of the man beside me, with eyes too calm and too keen, like he had lived through nights like this far too many times. His name was Nathan Hale, and on that first night of rain, everything began to change. If you're listening to this story and feel something stirring in your heart, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, hit the like button, and share Dear Single Mom on YouTube, so you won't miss the stories still to come. Quiet slices of everyday life filled with deep emotion, courageous journeys of women who once faced the darkness alone. And if you can, leave us a comment to let us know where you're listening from. Portland, Houston, Little Rock, or maybe a small town tucked somewhere in the heart of America. We truly want to know how far this story has traveled, and whether it's reaching someone's heart in a distant place I've never been. Now, let's continue with part 2 of this journey. I sat in the dark-colored car, wrapped in a silence so heavy it felt like it could crush the breath from my chest. My hands rested on my lap, still damp, trembling ever so slightly. The rain had not let up. Each heavy drop hit the windshield with a steady rhythm, as if time outside had slowed to a crawl. The subtle scent of leather from the seats mixed with the dampness of my rain-soaked coat, creating a strange sense that I was both safe and somewhere unfamiliar. Nathan sat beside me, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel. He didn't start the engine, didn't speak. He simply glanced at me once, not with suspicion or pity, but with the quiet patience of someone waiting for a person to catch their first breath after resurfacing from something deep and dark. I had never seen eyes like his. Calm, sharp, and unflinching, they didn't ask for explanations, and somehow, they made me feel like I didn't owe any. I turned my head to the window, to the soft yellow light casting long shadows on the rain-slick sidewalk, to the memory still etched in my mind of the man standing in the storm, Blake. I didn't need to hear his name or see his face. Just the shape of him and the way those eyes found mine through the glass was enough. He had found me, and I had nothing but a tray of food, shattered across the polished floor of a crowded restaurant. I still remembered the sharp sound of porcelain breaking, echoing like a gunshot. I remembered the faint intake of breath from the nearby table and the wide, frightened eyes of the waitress standing behind me. I didn't recall if I bent down or if someone pulled me away. All I remembered was the sight of Nathan rising from table 9, without a word, without hesitation, and his voice cutting through the air like a command issued to a world he had long since learned to control. "I'll take care of the rest." I still didn't know what made me follow a stranger out of the restaurant. Maybe I had no choice. Or maybe I was simply too exhausted to keep pretending I was still someone ordinary, when inside me was a storm I could no longer contain. When I stepped into the car, I brought nothing with me but my soaked uniform and a heart racing wildly with panic. I had not let anyone see me weak since the night I ran with my child. From the apartment where Blake had smashed everything in sight because I had texted a male coworker. I had built walls. I had stayed silent. I had disappeared, changed my name, lived quietly enough to convince even myself that a new beginning was possible. But the tray that shattered tonight was a reminder that I had never truly escaped. Nathan still said nothing. He simply exhaled, then slowly turned the car around, driving with a steadiness that felt rehearsed, as if he had already mapped out every street, every turn. I sat motionless, listening to the windshield wipers moving back and forth in their measured rhythm, wondering quietly to myself whether I had just stepped into a new nightmare or was finally being pulled out of an old one. I glanced at him again. In the dim glow of the streetlights, the lines of his face came into focus, cold and hard-edged, yet not threatening. If anything, there was something familiar in his solitude. He looked like someone who had lost something, immense, and had since learned to keep the world at arm's length. I didn't ask who he was. I didn't have the strength, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Because for the first time in many months, in that one fragile moment, I no longer felt completely alone. Even as the rain kept falling and my life had just been torn open by a ghost from the past, I could feel the steady presence of the man beside me. And the strange thing was, I wasn't afraid. Not then, not while Nathan was still driving, silent but deliberate, as though the night had only just begun, and he already knew exactly where it would end. The car slid through Portland's rain-drenched streets, the streetlights casting warped streaks of light across the windshield like memories I had once tried to forget. I didn't ask Nathan where he was taking me. I didn't try to guess. My body felt like a block of wet stone, worn out and stretched tight like the last string of a fraying cord. I remember clearly when he turned the car around. He never once looked back at the restaurant, as if he already knew he didn't need to, as if he understood exactly what was behind me. And he had chosen to rise, to walk away from his meal like a man who had been waiting for that moment all along. "I'll take care of the rest." Those 6 words still echoed in my mind, not like a command, but as a certainty. There was no hesitation in his voice, no trace of panic, no questions, only movement. When the car turned onto a quieter street and the light ahead changed to red, Nathan stopped. In that rare, motionless moment, I realized my hands were gripping the edge of the seat, fingernails pressed into the fabric. I released them, trying to breathe deeper. My whole body still felt trapped in survival mode, unable to believe I was truly safe. Nathan tilted his head slightly, his voice low and calm, unhurried. "Are you all right?" I nodded by reflex, but my throat felt tight. I couldn't lie, but I didn't want to admit that I was so afraid I could barely breathe. He didn't push. He just reached out and switched on the seat warmer. A small gesture, wordless. But something in my chest softened. Just a little. Maybe it was the first time in so many months that someone had done something kind for me without expecting anything in return. I glanced at him, really looking at him for the first time. His eyes stayed on the road. But something in the lines of his face told me he was calculating. Not with self-interest, but with preparation. The kind of preparation that comes from being familiar with risk, with loss, with consequences. I didn't sense this from his appearance, but from the quiet weight he carried, something honed by time and hurt. When the light turned green, he drove on, turning into a quieter neighborhood, the traffic thinning out. The rain eased to a faint drizzle, the sound of it softer now on the glass, as if the night itself had granted me a brief moment to breathe. Finally, I found my voice, barely more than a whisper. "Why did you do it? You don't know me. You could have ignored me like everyone else." He didn't look at me, but the corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile. More like he was remembering something. His answer was simple. "Because once, I didn't stand up when I should have. I'm not going to make that mistake again." I didn't know who he was talking about, or what had happened, but something in the way he said it made me fall silent. Maybe because I too carried a kind of regret like that, something I couldn't go back and fix. The car came to a stop in front of a small apartment building. It wasn't luxurious, but it looked safe, discreet. Nathan turned to me, and for the first time since we left the restaurant, his eyes met mine directly. "You're safe here. You can rest for a while. I'll be back soon." Before I could respond, he stepped out, walked around to my side, and opened the door. I didn't know what made me follow, but I stepped out, quietly, and walked with him inside. He didn't touch me, didn't guide or insist. He simply created a space calm enough for me to exist in, at least for tonight, and somehow, that alone was already more than enough. The apartment Nathan brought me to was small and quiet, tucked on the third floor of an old brick building veiled in ivy. Inside, the space was tidy and stripped of excess, yet clean and intentional, lit softly by the warm golden glow of a lamp in the corner of the living room. I sat on the edge of the sofa, hands resting in my lap, my thoughts spinning so fast I couldn't catch a single one. Nathan didn't say much. He only gestured toward the bathroom if I wanted to change, placed a folded towel and a clean t-shirt on the chair, then disappeared into the kitchen, giving me room to breathe. The door clicked gently behind him, and I sat there for a long time, staring out into the dark beyond the window pane. I couldn't remember the last time I had let myself sit still without listening for footsteps behind me, without checking the locks, without gripping a phone in my hand like a lifeline. Portland was never meant to be a destination. It was just the place I turned to when every other road had closed. Before that, I lived in Spokane, a smaller city where I taught literature at a public high school. I had what I thought was a full and simple life. A husband, a little girl, a house with a white picket fence and flower beds I tended to every weekend morning. I used to think I was one of the lucky ones. But Blake, the man who once held my hand beneath a canopy of red and gold leaves at our autumn wedding, did not stay the man in our wedding photo for long. It all began to change when I got pregnant. The financial worries, the unexplained silences, the temper that flared without warning. I told myself it was stress, that everyone had hard seasons, that he just needed time. But then the words grew colder, sharper. The anger didn't stop at words. And the first time he pulled me down to the floor over a broken mug he liked, I understood this wasn't a phase. It was who he really was. I tried to stay. For our child, for the hope that he might still change, for the belief that love could fix what was broken. I even kept it from my mother. I hid every trace. I learned to apply makeup like armor, wore long sleeves even in the heat of summer, mastered the art of smiling while breaking apart inside. But love wasn't enough, and the day my daughter, Ellie, looked up at me and asked why Daddy yelled so loud, I knew I couldn't let her grow up surrounded by fear. I chose to leave. I left my job, severed ties with friends, changed my number, erased every social account. I packed what I could into my old car, held Ellie close, and drove off into the night. I arrived in Portland on a cold morning at the edge of winter, knowing no one, having no plan, only one goal: to begin again. 3 weeks of odd jobs later, I found work at Juno's, a cozy Italian restaurant owned by an older woman named Grace, who didn't ask too many questions when she saw I needed the job and was willing to do anything. I found a small room to rent in a quiet neighborhood on the south side of the city, close to the bus stop and a preschool. Ellie started school. I started learning how to live without fear again. But fear, like fine dust in the air, lingers in every breath. I thought I had gone far enough. But tonight, when Blake appeared through the downpour outside the restaurant, I realized the past never really stays behind. It waits for the moment you let your guard down, and then it comes back, relentless, ready to drown everything you've rebuilt from the wreckage. And in that moment, in the sound of porcelain breaking and the stunned silence of the dining room, there was only one person who didn't flinch. One man who rose and said he'd take care of the rest. The only one who didn't look at me as someone broken, but as someone worth protecting. Nathan Hale. Blake was once the man who made me believe I was loved, and perhaps that was the most dangerous part of all. When we first met, he was the kind of man any young woman could fall for without trying. Tall, confident, with an easy smile and eyes that knew just how to make you feel like you were the center of the world. I met him at a college party, and it didn't take long for me to be drawn in. He knew how to listen, how to ask the right questions at the right time, and somehow, he was always there when I needed someone. I once believed Blake was safety. We married a year after I graduated, just as I began teaching and he was starting out as a real estate agent. The early days passed quietly, not without arguments, but he always knew how to smooth things over. A bouquet of flowers, a well-timed apology, sometimes a weekend away, just the two of us. I used to feel proud to have such a thoughtful husband, and I believed our love was the kind people talked about years later, with a soft smile and a little envy. But then, the changes began. Small things, at first, just enough to confuse me, but not enough to scare me. He'd ask again and again who I was talking to on the phone, who was in my list of friends, why I was 10 minutes later than usual getting home. Then came the suggestion that I should quit teaching and stay home, assuring me he could handle our finances. I said no. I loved my work, loved the feeling of walking into a classroom each morning to the bright eyes of students. He grew cold, stopped speaking to me for days. I found myself choosing my words carefully, afraid of that punishing silence, the quiet that felt more like a warning than peace. After I got pregnant, everything escalated faster. Blake was no longer the warm husband I'd once known. He grew short-tempered, volatile over the smallest things. A dinner he didn't like was enough to send a plate crashing to the floor. By the 5th month, he was checking my phone, demanding passwords, reading messages, deleting contacts he didn't approve of. I felt watched, even in my own home. Then one day, I sent a simple thank you to a male coworker who had covered my class so I could attend a prenatal appointment. Blake saw the message and erupted. He shattered my phone, hurled a chair into the wall, then shoved me hard to the carpet and screamed words I didn't think a husband could say to his wife. I wasn't badly hurt that day, not physically, but it was the first time I saw my own reflection in the mirror and didn't recognize the fear in my eyes. I told no one. I blamed the bruise on a fall, told the doctor I was clumsy. But I didn't sleep that night. Ellie wasn't even born yet, but I knew then that if I didn't leave, she would grow up in a world where love meant control and threats. So I began to plan. Quietly, slowly, I hid money in the first aid kit, set up a new email, opened a bank account under my cousin's name, and waited for the right time. Ellie was born in early autumn. For a little while, Blake seemed calmer. Maybe the baby was too small to absorb his rage, but it didn't last. Everything returned to the way it had been, except now I had to endure it while shielding a tiny life. When Ellie was nearly a year old, I left. No note, no warning. I took my daughter, got in the car, and drove into the night, leaving behind everything I once had, including the name I used to answer to. I thought I'd escaped, but seeing Blake last night, standing outside the restaurant window, with the same look in his eyes that he had the last time he exploded in that old kitchen, I realized something terrifying. Men like Blake, they don't forget, and they don't let go. I arrived in Portland on a cold December morning carrying an old suitcase, a child asleep in her car seat, and a heart stitched together just enough to keep from falling apart after too many breaks. The city greeted me with damp air, thick fog, and streets I had never walked before. I had no acquaintances, no place waiting for me, no clear plan. But I had Ellie, and I had a fragile belief that if I kept moving forward, the past would not be able to catch me in time. Those first days were not easy. I took any work offered, washing dishes in a small diner, stacking boxes in a warehouse, cleaning rooms in a roadside motel. Ellie went to hourly childcare, and sometimes I asked an elderly neighbor to watch her when my shift ran late. Life moved quietly, cautiously. I always looked around before stepping outside, checked the locks 3 times each night, and only called my mother when I knew I was in a place that could not be traced. After 3 weeks of scraping by, I happened to walk past Juno's. It was an Italian restaurant on a quiet corner, not luxurious but warm. Through the wide glass window, I saw soft golden light, polished wooden tables, and customers leaning toward one another with easy smiles, as if they were savoring every moment. Something in that scene made me stop. I pushed open the door, intending only to ask for dishwashing work. But the woman behind the counter, small in stature with silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, looked at me with an expression I had not seen from anyone since leaving. Her name was Grace, the owner. I remember her voice, low and slightly husky, and the way she didn't ask too many questions when I told her I was looking for a job. She told me to come back the next evening to try a serving shift. I learned quickly. I had no other choice. Every step I took, every glass of water I carried, every exchange with a customer had to be precise, because I knew that if I lost this job, I had nothing else to fall back on. Thankfully, Grace kept me on and made it official after just 1 week. I began earning steady income, moved Ellie to a more stable preschool, and rented a small room near the restaurant, so I could get home before she fell asleep. In the months that followed, Juno's became the only anchor I had. There, I didn't have to tell my story. No one asked about the faint scar on my wrist or why I startled awake in the middle of the night at the smallest sound. There, I was simply a hard-working employee, a single mother trying to build a life. No one knew my real name. I lived under the new one, lived as though my life had begun the day I stepped into that restaurant. I believed that if I kept living that way, if I stayed careful and quiet enough, Blake would never find me again. But I was wrong. And the tray that shattered last night cracked open everything I had tried so desperately to bury. I first sensed that something was wrong on Monday morning of the previous week, when my phone began vibrating non-stop inside the pocket of my apron. At first I thought it was Ellie's school, but when I saw an unfamiliar number, I simply shook my head and let it ring. I never answered unknown numbers. It was an unspoken rule I had lived by for nearly 2 years, ever since the day I disappeared from Spokane. But the phone didn't stop. It kept vibrating, every 10 minutes, then every 5, then almost without pause. When my shift ended, I went into the changing room, unlocked the phone, and saw a number that made the blood in my body turn to ice. 217 missed calls. In the span of 7 days, all from the same number. I didn't need a name to know it was Blake. I sat for a long time on the small wooden chair in the break room, gripping the phone as if it were something dangerous. My heartbeat thudded against my ribs, and in my mind, that familiar voice returned, whispering that I had slipped, that I had left some trail behind. I tried to remember everything from the past weeks. Had I changed my passwords? Had I accidentally posted a picture of Ellie with a location tag? Had I made even the smallest mistake? Every detail became an S. Accusation. I stood, checked the zipper on my bag, checked the lock on my phone, then rushed outside as though someone were already behind me. I picked Ellie up from school earlier than usual, took the long way home, shut every window, and pulled every curtain tight though the sky hadn't yet dimmed. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, my ears straining as if they could catch the sound of footsteps in the hallway. The phone on the nightstand kept buzzing in steady waves. I didn't dare turn it off. I left it there like a trap set open, as though if I kept my eyes on it, Blake couldn't get any closer. But I knew this feeling, this hunted feeling, and it was never wrong. Blake didn't call 217 times out of longing. He had found something. Maybe my new name, maybe the neighborhood where I lived, maybe Ellie's school. He never did anything without a reason, and he was never patient without a purpose. The next morning I arrived at Juno's earlier than usual. When Grace saw my face, she simply placed a gentle hand on my shoulder, asking nothing. She had always been like that, perhaps because she too had once started again from the ruins of a life. I stayed in the walk-in cooler longer than I needed, hiding my face in my sleeve so no one would see me crying. I hated this, hated the fear returning, hated the way I was living half in one life and half in another, and more than anything, I hated that Ellie had to see her mother no longer steady the way she once was. That night, I turned on my phone and recorded every missed call. There were no messages, no words, only silence. A thick, deliberate silence, as if he wanted me to understand that he was somewhere close. On the third night, when I looked through the restaurant window and saw a man standing across the street under the yellow glow, unmoving for nearly 10 minutes, I knew time was running out, which is why, when I saw Blake truly standing there tonight in the cold rain, I wasn't surprised. I had known. I had felt it coming, and the tray slipping from my hands wasn't an accident. It was my body's way of admitting it could no longer pretend. I was too tired to keep running. And in that moment, when everything felt ready to collapse, Nathan stood. No questions, no explanations, only 6 words. I will take care of the rest. Those 6 words held me together, if only for that one night. That night, after Nathan brought me to his apartment, I didn't sleep. I lay on the soft sofa, a thin blanket draped across my body, my eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to every faint sound from outside. The rain had stopped long ago, leaving behind a cold silence that filled the entire room. I don't know what time it was, but I remember clearly the breathless feeling when the phone buzzed again. I had set it to silent, but the screen still lit up, flashing in the dark like a blade carving through my chest every time that unfamiliar number appeared. I knew it was him. No one else would call hundreds of times. No one else knew how to strangle me with silence alone. I sat up, quietly walking to the small kitchen window, gently parting the curtain with my fingers. Outside, the darkness was heavy. The only light came from a bus stop in the distance, casting a dull glow across the wet pavement. I held my breath. Something shifted across the alley. A car, no headlights, parked in shadow. My heart began to race, not because I was certain it was him, but because I no longer knew how to separate fear from fact. Every alarm in my mind screamed that I was being watched. I stepped back, drew the curtain shut, and returned to the sofa. And there, in the quiet, I found myself wondering why Nathan had intervened, why he had stood up in the middle of that restaurant, said one simple sentence, and pulled me out of the panic that had wrapped around me like a noose. I had never been the one rescued. I had always been the one running, the one making plans, the one surviving alone. But that night, for the first time in so long, I wasn't running alone. Around 4 a.m, I heard a faint sound from the hallway. I shot upright. Nathan stepped through the door, his coat draped over one arm, his shoes soaked through from the night rain. He glanced at me quickly, then walked straight into the kitchen and flicked on a soft light. He didn't ask why I was still awake. He didn't seem surprised. He poured 2 glasses of water, handed one to me, then sat in the chair across from mine and let out a long breath. "He came," Nathan said. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't need confirmation. Maybe my instincts hadn't failed me. Maybe Nathan had seen the car. Maybe he had spent the night circling the block, making sure no one followed me here. I clutched the glass of water, not from the cold, but from the storm inside me, a chaotic blend of fear, anger, and gratitude. Nathan looked at me again, longer this time, and spoke in a voice so calm it unsettled me. "You won't have to handle this alone anymore." I smiled faintly, tired. No one can carry my past for me. No one can live this life in my place. But in that moment, when he said those words, I understood something I hadn't let myself believe in a long time. Some burdens only need to be shared a little, just enough, for us not to collapse under their weight. I told Nathan everything. About Blake, about the years I lived as a shadow, about Ellie, about why I couldn't go back. I spoke in fragments, out of order, as if I had to get it out now or never. Nathan listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't ask for more. And when I finally stopped, he asked me just one question. "Do you believe he'll come back?" I nodded. "And I don't think he'll wait long." Nathan stood, pulled his phone from his coat pocket, typed something quickly, then turned back to me. His expression had changed. It was no longer soft. It was cold, sharp, calculating. "Then we won't wait long either," he said. The next morning, when I woke, the first light of day filtered softly through the slats of the curtains, casting a gentler hush over the room after a long, storm-heavy night. I sat up slowly, the blanket slipping down to my feet, my body heavy with exhaustion, my mind weighed down by days of sleeplessness and an anxiety that had been building like a tide I could no longer hold back. In the kitchen, Nathan was already making coffee. He wore a black shirt, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbows, his expression calm and unreadable, as always. Neither of us spoke about the night before. Not about the strange car. Not about the feeling of being watched. Not about Blake. Nathan set a cup of coffee in front of me, then took the seat across the table, his eyes focused on his phone. He typed something short, checked a screen I couldn't see, then slipped the device back into his pocket. I looked at him. This man who just days ago had been a stranger sitting at table 9 in the restaurant. The man who had seen me drop a tray when I spotted the figure who had haunted my life. The man who hadn't asked questions, hadn't panicked, hadn't pressed. He had only stood and said he would handle the rest. But now, sitting across from him, I no longer saw a customer. I saw someone who had known danger. Not the kind you imagine from stories or headlines, but the real kind. The kind where a wrong decision can cost you your life. There was something in Nathan's eyes that told me he had seen the darkest side of people, and maybe that's why he had recognized it in me. From the very first glance, he wasn't the only person who had seen my fear, but he was the only one who had understood where it came from. When I first walked away from my violent marriage, I thought that if I put enough miles between me and the past, it would lose its grip. But fear doesn't live in distance. It lives in the habits we learn to survive. In the way I always sat with my back to the wall. In how I avoided the eyes of men whose voices were low and footsteps heavy. In how I kept my bag beside my bed every night, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Nathan had seen all of that without needing me to explain. He never asked why I checked the rearview mirror 3 times before every right turn. Never asked how I could tell, by sound alone, when someone was unlocking a door from the outside. He simply gave me space, enough safety, to speak when I was ready. That, no one else had done. In all the months since I'd left, I'd lived among kind people, compassionate people, polite people. But only Nathan had looked through the surface of my panic and seen its root, even without hearing the story. And that, in a strange and quiet way, gave me more peace than any reassurance ever had. I took a small sip of coffee, My hand still trembled slightly. Nathan looked out the window, where the morning sun poured in, glinting off the lingering rain on the glass. He spoke without turning to me. "You need to be ready. If he found you once, he won't stop." I nodded. I didn't argue. I had lived long enough with Blake's shadow to know what kind of man he was. Once he caught the scent, he followed it like a ghost, relentless, until there was nowhere left to hide. Nathan turned back to me then, his gaze softer this time. "But you won't face this alone, no matter where this goes." I opened my mouth to thank him, but my throat tightened, not because I didn't believe him, but because I wasn't used to someone choosing to stay, even knowing what stood ahead. And maybe, in that very moment, I began to realize that Nathan's presence wasn't just a coincidence. It was the thing I hadn't dared hope for, someone who saw my fear, and stayed anyway. That afternoon, when I returned to my small rental room on the south side of the city, the unease crept in again, slow and quiet like mist slipping under a door. Nathan walked me to the building, his tone steady as he reminded me to lock both bolts and call him the moment anything felt off. He wasn't trying to frighten me, but the calmness in his voice made it clear he wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. I nodded, took the bag of groceries he had picked up for me, stepped inside, and closed the door. But even with the locks turned and the curtains drawn, just as I did every day, I still felt my skin chill every time I passed the window. I told myself I was just on edge, that I was being cautious, but what I couldn't shake was the weight in the air, the quiet tension that settles right before a storm breaks. Ellie was napping in the room next door. I sat in silence at the small kitchen table, my hand wrapped around a cup of cold tea I hadn't touched. I stood, pulling the curtain aside ever so slightly, and that's when I saw him. Not Blake, a stranger, standing across the street, leaning casually against a lamppost, his head lowered beneath a baseball cap, hands tucked into the pockets of a jacket. I couldn't see his face clearly in the shadow, but he stood too still, too long. He didn't check his phone, didn't smoke, didn't walk. He just stood there, gaze fixed in the direction of my building. I dropped the curtain at once, heart pounding against my ribs. I stepped back, tried to slow my breathing. I didn't know if he had seen me, but something deep inside, something built from months of running and learning how to survive, told me that man wasn't standing there by accident. I grabbed my phone, thumb hovering as I searched for Nathan's number, but I paused. Part of me didn't want to escalate things. Part of me was panicking too much to think clearly. So I sent him a text. "There's a strange man outside the building." He didn't respond right away. But 15 minutes later, I saw the familiar black Audi ease up to the curb just a few meters down the street. Nathan stepped out and walked the sidewalk with the casual air of someone out for a stroll. The man in the cap was still there. He didn't move, but when Nathan drew closer, he turned, walking in the opposite direction, his steps unhurried, but clearly deliberate. Nathan didn't chase him. He simply stopped, pulled out his phone, and recorded something. I didn't know what, but when he turned to look up at the third floor, his eyes found mine through the window curtain, as if he knew I'd be watching. He gave a small nod. I couldn't tell if it was to reassure me or to confirm what I feared. But somehow, with just that single gesture, I could breathe again. That night, Nathan called. His voice was still calm, still low, but there was weight behind every word. "You need to know," he said. "This isn't just about Blake. He's not working alone. And the man outside your building wasn't a coincidence." I tightened my grip on the phone. Inside me, fear rose once more, but this time, it came laced with something else. A quiet, simmering anger. Anger at being hunted again. Anger that the fragile piece I had barely begun to build was already on the edge of crumbling. But even with all the tangled emotions twisting inside me, there was one thing I saw more clearly than ever. I was no longer the woman I used to be. No longer shrinking away every time someone watched me too closely. And this time, I wasn't alone. Because the man who had seen the fear in me, the one no one else had ever truly noticed, was now standing out there, ready to face what was coming. Even as the darkness began to gather from both sides. The next morning, Nathan arrived earlier than usual. He didn't make small talk, didn't circle around the point. He simply told me to get ready. We were going to meet someone. I asked who. He looked at me for a long moment, then gave me a name I had never heard before, but the weight of it hit me like a cold wind. Marco Vega. The name echoed in the air like a warning bell. I didn't know who Marco was, didn't know what role he played in the tightening knot of events surrounding me. But from the tone in Nathan's voice, I understood one thing clearly. This was not a man one approached lightly. We left the apartment complex in silence, not speaking once during the drive. Nathan drove carefully, deliberately, never turning onto a street without first checking the mirrors. At every red light, his eyes flicked quickly to the rearview. It made me nervous, but at the same time, it reminded me that I was sitting next to someone who didn't just live with fear, he stayed one step ahead of it. We finally stopped in front of an abandoned building on the eastern edge of Portland. It looked like nothing, the kind of forgotten place people pass without a second glance. But inside that crumbling silence was where I saw, for the first time, the face of a man whose name alone could make others go pale. Marco Vega stood waiting in the middle of a large, dust-covered room. The light from a single hanging bulb cast uneven shadows across his sharp features. There was a faint smile on his lips, but it never reached his eyes. He wasn't as physically imposing as I had imagined, but there was something in the way he carried himself, something that made it impossible to look away. His gaze brushed past me for only a second, but it was the kind of look that told me he already knew exactly who I was. There was no greeting, no formality. He looked straight at Nathan, voice low and coarse, like embers burning in the throat. "You brought her in." Nathan didn't answer right away. His eyes didn't flinch. She was already in it before I showed up. "I'm just doing what's right." Marco gave a dry, humorless chuckle that echoed off the empty walls. "Right or wrong doesn't matter anymore, Hale. What matters is the price we're willing to pay." Then he turned to me, and this time his gaze lingered, measuring, weighing. "You know who your ex-husband's tied to, don't you?" I nodded. By now, I had put together enough of the broken pieces to understand that Blake wasn't just an abusive man with a temper. He was connected to people like Marco, the kind of web you don't walk away from in one piece. Marco stepped closer, stopping a few paces in front of me. He didn't threaten, he didn't raise his voice. But there was a pressure in the air around him, something you could feel more than hear. I tightened my grip to keep from shaking. "You have a daughter." He said it like he was reciting a file. "Ellie, 5 years old, curly hair, likes butter cookies." I lifted my head to look at him. I didn't reply, but I didn't look away either. Marco gave a small nod, almost approving. Some people do wrong because they choose to. Some get dragged into it because they loved the wrong person. I don't need to know which kind you are. I just need to know that if I help Nathan protect you, it won't come cheap. I turned to Nathan, searching his face for something: hesitation, reassurance, doubt. But he stood still, his expression unreadable, unshaken. Marco laughed again, low and quiet this time. He turned his back, walking toward the door, his voice leaving a trail in the thick air behind him. "Marco Vega has seen your face. That means you either survive all of this, or you'll have nowhere left to hide." The door closed behind him, and I stood there, no longer under the illusion that this was still a one-sided escape. The darkness now had a face, and its name was Marco Vega. After the meeting with Marco Vega, the air between Nathan and me grew quieter, not with tension, but with a kind of understanding that no longer needed words. We had crossed a threshold, passed from strangers into something else, something that moved with trust. We had stepped together into a world where danger was no longer abstract. It had shape, it had names, it breathed down our necks. On the drive back, I didn't ask Nathan any more about Marco. I knew he would tell me what I needed to know, when it mattered. Instead, I sat in silence, eyes turned toward the window, watching buildings glide past like fragments of memory I was trying to leave behind. When we pulled up in front of my apartment, I thought he would turn the car around and drive off again, but Nathan shut off the engine, turned to me, and said in a voice so steady it sent a deeper shiver through me than panic ever could, "You shouldn't stay here tonight." I looked at him. Part of me wanted to say no, to cling to that last shred of independence I'd spent so long building, the armor of a woman who had survived by always keeping control. But the rest of me knew he was right. I nodded. He said nothing more. We turned the car around and headed back to his place. By the time I came out of the shower, Ellie was already fast asleep in the living room, curled beneath a soft blanket Nathan had laid out for her. I stood in the small kitchen, a cup of hot tea cradled in my hands, and for the first time, I felt that this shelter I had been offered wasn't just out of duty. There was something in the way Nathan looked at me, in the way he spoke, that no longer felt like the kindness of a stranger. It felt like a man who had stepped into my life not by accident, but by something quieter, deeper. When I set my cup down, he stepped closer. Not too close, not forceful, just near enough that I felt my breath shift. "Have you ever thought you might love someone again?" The question landed softly, but it struck something hard. I didn't answer right away. Not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I had thought too much. And each time, I had pulled myself away from it. I'd believed that anyone who came close would be swallowed into the spiral of Blake, of my past, of everything I couldn't seem to outrun. But now, with Nathan standing here, not retreating, not afraid, I wasn't so sure. I lifted my eyes to his. He didn't look away. There was calm in his gaze, but something else too, something real, something unmistakably human. Maybe I hadn't dared to dream of this. Maybe I had convinced myself that dreaming was dangerous. But here, with this man who wasn't promising anything, who wasn't asking for anything, who simply stayed and saw me as I truly was, I felt something shift inside my chest. When he reached for my hand, I didn't pull back. His hand was warm, steady, not gripping but resting there, like a question asked in silence. And me, after everything I had lost, after every time I'd broken, I nodded. In that quiet night, I was no longer just the woman who ran. I was someone seen, someone protected, and for the first time in many long months, I felt something stronger than fear. Trust. And in a world closing in from every side, maybe that was the only thing left that could still keep me standing. The next morning, Nathan was gone early. He left only a folded piece of his paper on the kitchen counter, a few short lines written in his clear, steady hand. He'd be back before noon, and told me to rest, not to worry about a thing. But I couldn't sleep. Ellie was still sound asleep in the next room, her small face so peaceful it made my chest ache. Looking at her, I remembered with painful clarity why I ran, why I endured, why I planned, why I left everything behind. I only ever wanted one thing: for her to grow up in a world without shouting across dinner tables, without hands slamming down in anger, without watchful, punishing eyes or doors slamming shut in the middle of the night. I sat on the sofa, eyes fixed on the window as morning light filtered in, catching the fine dust floating quietly in the air. Everything felt unnaturally still, like the whole world was holding its breath, waiting for something to come. When Nathan returned, he said very little. He placed a thick envelope on the table, then sat beside me, his body sinking back into the chair like someone who had been awake for far too long. I looked at the envelope, then at him. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away. He clicked the clasp open, pulled out a stack of documents, and laid them in front of me. A new birth certificate, a new passport, an entirely new identity, a bank account under a different name. There were even plane tickets and a rental agreement for a small home in another state. Everything was prepared, organized, carefully thought out, so complete, so seamless. I couldn't find the words. I reached out and touched the papers, and it felt like touching the edge of an escape I hadn't dared to believe was real. Nathan looked at me, his eyes steady, free of pressure or urgency. "This is the safest way. If you decide to go, everything's ready." I turned to him, my heart pounding in my chest. Part of me wanted to grab the envelope, run far and fast, disappear again to protect Ellie. But another part, the part I had stopped trying to silence, was looking at the man who had stayed, the man who hadn't turned away when I told him everything. I asked, barely a whisper, not even sure what I was hoping for. "What about you?" Nathan looked at me for a long time. He didn't answer quickly, and I knew it wasn't an easy question. But when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, measured, and honest. "I'll do whatever it takes to keep you and Ellie safe. Whether that means leaving with you, or staying here to face what's coming. I won't force your choice. But I'm not disappearing." I held the envelope, gripping it gently, as if I could feel the weight of every possibility inside. A new life, a clean start, a place where no one knew my name, a second chance built with real documents, with real identities, and no ghosts trailing behind. But it also meant walking away from Nathan, from the one person who had seen me at my worst and didn't flinch. I stood, walked to the window, and looked out onto the quiet street, where the world still moved as if nothing had happened. I thought about the years behind me, the pain I had swallowed, the silence I had learned to live inside. I thought of Ellie, and of the man sitting behind me, waiting without pressure for whatever I would decide. And for the first time in a long, long while, I realized I was no longer the woman who always ran. I turned back, placed the envelope gently on the table, and looked Nathan in the eye. "You know, the scariest part isn't being chased. It's living your whole life without ever being allowed to be yourself. And I think it's time I stop living like a shadow." Nathan didn't say a word, but in his eyes I saw something clearer than any reply. He understood. And this time, we wouldn't be walking forward as strangers. We would be moving as people who chose to stay. Together. Even when life promised nothing certain. We didn't say much after I placed the envelope back on the table. Nathan simply gave the smallest of nods, then quietly gathered the papers, his hands careful, almost reverent, as though each document was a lifeline to a version of my life I had just chosen to let go. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't remind me that the other path was the safest. In his silence, I felt the weight of a question he'd been carrying for a long time. A question he had never spoken aloud. Would I choose him? Not as a protector, not as a place to hide, not as a temporary salvation, but as a person to walk beside, into whatever this dangerous, uncertain life might bring, without ever looking back. I had seen that question in the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching, in the way he touched my hand only briefly, then let go, as if afraid that holding on too long might scare me away, in the way he made coffee in the mornings, always remembering the exact amount of sugar I liked, never once asking why I drank it cold instead of hot. There are things we don't need to ask, because the answers live quietly in every gesture. I don't know when Nathan began to feel something for me. Maybe it was that first night in the rain, when I walked out of the restaurant pale and shaking. Maybe it was all the times he caught me freezing at the sight of a car parked too long outside. Or maybe it was when he saw that I wasn't weak the way I thought I was, that I was just someone learning to survive with whatever I had left. But I know exactly when I began to see Nathan differently. It was the moment I realized he didn't need to ask to understand, that even without promises, he stayed. That morning, after Ellie woke up, I took her to the park nearby. Nathan came with us. He didn't try to step in, didn't try to become anything too big in her eyes. He just sat on the bench, quiet, watching while I pushed the swing. And then, in one small, unexpected moment, Ellie turned back, called out to me, and suddenly ran toward him. Nathan leaned forward, opening his arms without hesitation, and she ran straight into them, wrapping her little arms around him like they had known each other forever. I stood a few steps away, silent, just watching. And in that moment, I realized something I had never let myself consider. I didn't just want safety. I wanted a family, a home where Ellie could grow up with more than protection. I wanted her to grow up with love, with steadiness, with a man who didn't make his care conditional. That afternoon, while I was putting things away in the kitchen, Nathan stepped into the doorway and leaned against the frame. He didn't speak. He just looked at me, and I turned to him, asking what it was. He shook his head, his lips pressed together like he was holding back something he didn't know if he should say. But I knew. Right then, I knew he was swallowing the same question he had always kept to himself. So I walked over, placed my hand on his chest, where his heartbeat pulsed steady beneath my fingers, like a quiet reminder that life still held some things you could trust. I'm staying not just because it's safe, Nathan. I'm staying because of you. He looked at me, eyes deep and wide like the ocean, but this time, there was light in them. A soft, unspoken light I had once believed existed only in dreams. And maybe we didn't need to ask anything anymore, because sometimes the biggest questions in life don't need to be spoken. They only need someone brave enough to answer first. I used to believe that choosing to stay was a sign of weakness, that if I didn't leave, didn't run far enough, I was risking Ellie's safety, gambling with the one fragile thing I had sworn to protect. For years, I had trained myself to believe that disappearing was the only way to survive. But now, standing in the kitchen, watching Nathan gently reach for my hand, as if even he couldn't quite believe this moment was real, I knew I no longer believed that. Courage isn't always in the leaving. Sometimes, it's in the staying, in setting down the weight, in breathing. I had carried fear with me for so many years. It had become part of my skin. I slept with it, woke with it, cooked breakfast with it, walked Ellie to school with it. I smiled at the world while holding myself tight enough to run at a moment's notice. But when I placed that envelope back on the table, when I looked into Nathan's eyes and whispered that I wasn't going to leave again, I realized I was no longer living by fear. I had outgrown it. Or maybe I had finally decided not to let it speak louder than what I truly wanted. I don't know what's waiting for us. I don't know what Blake will do. I don't know if Marco Vega will keep his word, but I know I'm not alone anymore. And for the first time, I didn't choose retreat. I chose to stay. Because I want Ellie to grow up in a world where her mother is strong, not just because she knows how to run, but because she knows when to stop and fight. I want her to grow up in a home filled with laughter, where a man's hands never break a glass out of anger. I want to hold Nathan's hand in a crowded street without glancing over my shoulder. I want to wake up in the morning not gasping from nightmares, but breathing in the light pouring through the window. I want a life, not just survival. And to have that, I know I must choose it. I already have. No one forced me, no one gave me an ultimatum, no one urged me to run, but no one promised to stay either. That's what makes this decision mine. Entirely, unmistakably, mine. And I choose to stay. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face everything that's coming, but I know that if I don't begin here, I'll never know who I could become. Nathan's hand tightened gently around mine, and in his eyes, I saw something like a quiet exhale. Not because I had chosen him, but because, finally, I had chosen myself. And maybe, in a world full of roads that all lead to escape, staying beside someone is its own kind of bravery. Nathan didn't tell me right away, but I knew he had done something after I chose to stay. Maybe it was the way he lingered in silence longer than usual. Maybe it was the way his eyes drifted toward the far end of the street when he thought I wasn't looking. The gaze of a man preparing to step into the dark so that everything behind him could remain in the light. I didn't ask. Not because I didn't want to know, but because I trusted that if the time came, he would tell me. And that night, after Ellie had gone to sleep, when it was just the two of us sitting in the living room beneath the soft glow of the lamp reflecting against the window, Nathan finally spoke. He told me Marco Vega had made a deal, not the kind written down with terms and signatures, but the kind understood between people who've lived too close to the edge of survival to need words. Marco wanted Blake not to scare him, not to warn him, to eliminate him. Completely. Blake hadn't just been my violent ex-husband, not just a man with a foul temper and a dirty past. He had crossed lines he was never meant to touch. And now, Marco needed someone to draw him out of the shadows. Nathan was the only one who could. When I heard this, my chest tightened. I asked if he had agreed. He didn't answer directly, but in his eyes, I saw a quiet ache, the kind of pain a man carries when the weight of what he's about to do sits heavy on his soul. He only said one thing, soft and steady, and it made my whole body go still. I can't keep watching you live in fear. Whatever the cost, I want this to end. Nathan is not a reckless man. He doesn't raise his voice. He doesn't need to look dangerous to be brave, but he is the kind of man who steps forward when everyone else pulls back. And this time, he wasn't walking toward danger because he had to. He was doing it because he loved me. He didn't say it. He didn't have to. I saw it in every choice he made, every glance, every silent space he left for me to breathe, to choose, to speak. That kind of love speaks louder than words. And because he loved me, I was terrified that Nathan was offering up his safety for a woman still learning how to stand again, terrified he wouldn't come back, terrified that Marco Vega wouldn't keep his word. I gripped his hand. Promise me you won't go alone. Nathan looked at me, and this time I saw real hesitation. He was used to facing things alone, but I wasn't that woman anymore. I wasn't waiting behind a door, hoping things would fix themselves. If he was going to risk everything for me, I had a right to walk beside him. He nodded. But you have to promise me, if anything happens, you protect Ellie first. You're her mother. You're her survival. I nodded too. Not out of fear, but because I understood that love, real love, also means shielding the person you love from carrying more than they should. That night, when I lay beside him, 1,000 questions pressed against my chest with no answers. But one thing I knew with more clarity than I'd ever known anything. Nathan was preparing to walk into a storm, to trade danger for our peace. And if he was going to gamble with the dark, I would be here, waiting for him with the door open, with arms ready, and with a life that no longer ran from itself. Nathan left in the early morning, before sunlight had a chance to filter through the trees outside the window. He didn't wake me, but I had already been awake. I sat at the edge of the bed, watching him in silence, as he moved through the room with the quiet precision of a man preparing for the final battle. There were no tearful goodbyes, no cinematic promises, only the way he looked at me long and steady before he turned away, as if he were memorizing every line of my face, every small crease near my eyes, every expression I hadn't realized I wore. I gripped my hands tightly, trying not to shake. I knew this wasn't just a meeting between men in the shadows. This was a wager, and Nathan was placing everything he had on the table. His freedom, his name, his dignity, his chance to return to a quiet life beside me and my daughter. I had once asked him why he didn't just walk away, why he didn't leave me behind and keep living the peaceful life he could have had. And he answered me with a voice so sure it broke something open in me. Because if I leave you to face this alone, I won't be able to live with myself. Because if you're afraid and I stay still, I'm no longer who I am. Marco Vega had made his terms clear. He didn't want more ties to Blake, and he didn't want to handle it in a way that made noise. Nathan was the only one who could get close enough, without raising alarms, without suspicion, and the price for that proximity was precision. Bring Blake to the right place, at the right time, under the right pretense. I knew it wouldn't be easy. Blake was not predictable. He wasn't stupid. He was a man who had survived through control, through fear, through bending others to his will. And more than anyone, I knew how he would react if he felt the trap closing. But Nathan said yes, not because Marco forced him, but because he wanted to finish what I had never been able to. I don't know exactly who Nathan met, what he promised, what he risked, but I know this. To protect me, Nathan was willing to give up everything. I remembered that first night I saw him at Juno's, when he rose from table 9 and told me he would take care of the rest. Back then, I didn't know who he was. I didn't know what he had faced. I didn't know whether I could trust him. But now I do. He is the man who stood in the storm instead of turning away. A man who doesn't need to be thanked, who simply needs to know he didn't look away when someone needed help. That afternoon, I sat by the window, eyes fixed on the long, endless stretch of street outside. Every passing car made my heart jolt. I wanted it to be him. I wanted him to return, unchanged, unbroken. I had already lost everything once. I had once believed I would never feel love again. But Nathan came quietly, without promises, without demands. He stayed. And in doing so, he gave me a peace I had stopped believing was possible. And now, while he faced the man who drove me into years of hiding, all I wanted, more than revenge, more than justice, was for love to be strong enough to lead him home. Because for the first time in my life, I knew what it meant for someone to be willing to lose everything, just so I wouldn't have to lose one more thing. And that, to me, is greater than love. That is sacrifice. The true essence of a man who chooses to protect not out of duty, but out of devotion, out of something deeper than words, something unshakable, something real. Nathan had planned everything with precision. He left no trace, avoided reckless moves, and never went in alone unless there was no other choice. But what he hadn't accounted for was Blake's volatility, a man who carried a slow-burning rage, always waiting for the right moment to ignite when he sensed betrayal. Nathan arranged to meet him in an abandoned parking lot on the outskirts of the city, a former freight depot before the area was cleared for new housing developments. It was a place without cameras, without foot traffic, quiet enough for a deal to end without a sound. Nathan arrived with empty hands, just as Marco had instructed. No weapons, no backup, no safety net. Only a promise he had made to me that he would return. Blake was more than 30 minutes late. He pulled up in an old silver car, its paint chipped and dull, but the eyes behind the windshield were exactly as I remembered. Cold, blank, dangerous. Nathan stood his ground. When Blake stepped out, he didn't smile. He just stared at Nathan from a distance, then walked forward slowly, each step a deliberate measure of what Nathan had come there to do. "I know you didn't come here just to talk," Blake said, his voice laced with a sneer. Nathan didn't reply. He spoke only one sentence. "This is the end." Blake laughed louder than necessary. "The end? Who said I'm done? I'm not finished with her." Then his voice dropped, low and venomous. "She really thought she could run forever? No one walks away from me. No one leaves without a price." Nathan took a step closer, eyes locked on Blake. "Don't talk about her again." Blake lifted his chin, squinting, like he was truly seeing Nathan for the first time. "You actually care, don't you? You think you can replace me? I had everything. I'm the father of that child. I was the first one she chose. You're just the guy picking up scraps." Nathan didn't argue. He didn't lash out. He didn't let anger cloud his judgment. He simply replied, his voice low, solid as stone. "But I'm the only one willing to stand between you and her. Do you know why she ran? It wasn't because you were strong. It was because she didn't want her daughter growing up with a man like you. You didn't lose her because she left. You lost her because you never knew how to love anything but yourself." Blake was silent for a moment. Then he pulled a gun from behind his back. Nathan didn't move, but from a short distance away, another car rolled in, its headlights cutting straight through the gloom. The door opened. Marco Vega stepped out, expression unreadable. Two men moved swiftly, disarmed Blake before he had the chance to react. Marco looked at him, then turned to Nathan. "Getting him here and staying alive? You did better than I thought." Nathan gave a slight nod, eyes never leaving Blake, who struggled uselessly in their grip. Then Marco leaned in, whispered something in Blake's ear. quiet enough that no one else could hear. But I believe he said the one thing Blake never expected, that the game had ended long ago, and he no longer had the power to deliver the final word. They dragged Blake away, his eyes still locked on Nathan, burning with disbelief. But this time, he said nothing, because behind that stare was the dawning realization that he no longer controlled anything. He had lost. Nathan stood still, exhaled slowly. Rain began to fall, light and steady, just like the night I dropped the tray of food, as if closing a full circle. He turned, walked slowly back toward the car, and in that moment, there was only one truth in his heart. He had done it, not to be a hero, but so that Ellie and I could live a life where we weren't afraid to walk out the door, and for that, every risk he had taken was worth it. Nathan returned as the sky turned dusky, the rain still falling, though no longer as heavy as it had been that morning. I heard the door open. Softly, the familiar rhythm of his footsteps unhurried, steady, not trembling, just the weariness of someone who had stepped out of a storm far greater than mere weather. I was sitting on the sofa. Ellie was fast asleep in the bedroom, and for a brief moment, it felt like my heart stopped when the door finally closed behind him. Nathan stood there, his coat soaked through, hair disheveled, dark circles under his eyes, but he was whole. I didn't say a word. I just walked to him and wrapped my arms around him tightly, and for the first time, he didn't hold back. He pulled me into him, buried his face into the curve of my shoulder, as if letting go would cause everything to collapse. We stood like that for a long time, no words needed. In that embrace was everything: relief, gratitude, the kind of quiet exhale you only feel when you know you're finally safe. All the things never spoken but always there, pulsing in every heartbeat. Later, Nathan told me everything. He didn't leave out a detail. From the first moment he saw Blake, to the instant Marco Vega stepped out of the vehicle with two silent men trailing him like shadows. Even Blake's eyes when he realized it was over. Even the last thing Marco whispered to him. Nathan told it all, his voice steady like he was locking away the last pieces of danger into a drawer, closing it with the calm of someone who had already made peace with what needed to be done. I asked him if he was sure Blake wouldn't come back. Nathan didn't offer a promise, but he said something that settled deeper than any vow. There are people who, once broken at the right point, can never come back the same, and there are systems that once they reject someone, never let them rise again. I understood. I didn't need Blake to disappear from the world, I just needed him gone from mine, gone from Ellie's. And now, with his shadow no longer following me into my dreams, I knew I had finally stepped out, from under it. The days that followed passed slowly. No more phone calls in the night. No more figures standing across the street. No more nightmares waking me in tears. Only stillness. Morning coffee. Ellie's giggles over bear-shaped pancakes. Nathan's hand resting at the small of my back as we lay together at night. I started smiling more. I began to look in the mirror longer without flinching away from my own eyes. The apartment no longer felt like a temporary shelter. It felt like home. And Nathan, the man who once entered my life like a cold wind in a rainy night, now stayed like late sunlight, soft, certain, enduring. One day, Ellie brought me a picture she'd drawn. In it, there were 3 figures standing side by side. I was in the middle, holding Nathan's hand on one side, Ellie's on the other. Behind us was a house, its door open. I asked her who it was. She beamed. "It's our family." I looked at Nathan. He smiled, said nothing, just placed a hand on my shoulder. Neither of us spoke, but I knew. After all the storms, what remained wasn't wreckage. It was what had stood strong through it all. And I knew, this time, I didn't have to run anymore, because I was finally living a life I didn't need to escape from. After the storm, there is life. And in it, we found each other not as survivors clinging to what's left, but as 2 people who chose, despite everything, to begin again, to love, fully and fearlessly, knowing the cost, and choosing it anyway. Life after the storms turned out to be quieter than I had imagined. There was no grand moment announcing that we were safe, no bells ringing to mark the end of fear. Instead, there were small things so ordinary, so gentle that if I hadn't paid attention, I might have missed them. And yet, it was exactly those tiny moments that stitched my once broken heart back together, day by day. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the blinds in the kitchen, was filled with the scent of toasted bread, I noticed that Nathan had bought the exact kind of butter I liked. Not the cheapest kind, not the most convenient, but the one I'd once mentioned, softly, in a grocery aisle, thinking he hadn't heard. I stood there, holding a warm slice of bread in my hand. my eyes stinging not from smoke or onions, but from the quiet realization. To be listened to, remembered, in the smallest corners of daily life, that's a gift not everyone gets. Ellie had begun adjusting to our new rhythm. She went to the elementary school nearby, had learned the names of a few classmates, and brought home a notebook filled with tiny stickers she proudly showed me each evening. Nathan usually picked her up on the afternoons. I worked a second shift at the cafe, and without fail, the two of them returned with a story that made me laugh. One day, it was about a chubby cat blocking the sidewalk. Another, it was Ellie announcing she'd used justice law to correct a boy in the wrong lunch line, prompting an unplanned parent-teacher meeting for Nathan. At night, when we sat on the couch together, Nathan and I didn't talk much about the past anymore. Instead, we talked about whether we should grow herbs on the balcony, or whether the kitchen wall would look better in sage green or dusty blue. We weren't trying to build something perfect. We were just living day by day in the quiet kindness we'd each learned through years of pain and loss. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still woke from old dreams, Blake's cold voice chasing me, his eyes freezing me in place. But when I opened my eyes, Nathan's hand was always there, reaching for mine as if it had been waiting all along. And I'd fall back asleep, knowing that those memories couldn't hurt me anymore, not when I had this present to hold on to. One Saturday morning, I was doing laundry while Nathan mowed the backyard. Ellie ran into the house, her hand tightly gripping a tiny daisy. She beamed as she pressed it into my palm and said, "This is a happiness flower. I made that name up." I looked down at my hand, at the tiny white bloom resting quietly against the lines of my skin, and I understood real happiness doesn't lie in how much pain you've survived. It lives in the fact that after everything, you're still able to smile at something as simple as this. Nathan walked in then, a blade of grass stuck to his cheek, sweat beading at his temple. I burst out laughing so freely, so unexpectedly, that I surprised myself. He looked at me, then at the flower in my hand, and said nothing, because he understood. Sometimes, the heaviest thing in life is not sorrow or grief, but the weight of ordinary moments, carrying with them the full cost of everything we've fought for. And we, after everything, had finally learned how to live inside those moments. Fully, gratefully. There are promises that are never spoken aloud, yet they are held onto with the quiet reverence of a sacred vow, like an invisible thread binding two people together through trust and unwavering loyalty. Nathan and I never sat down to map out our future in any concrete way. We didn't make 5-year plans, didn't talk about marriage, didn't name the things that still felt too tender to define. But each day, in the smallest of gestures he offered to me and to Ellie, there were silent promises that needed no words to be fully understood by the heart. On one evening, colder than usual, I was putting away dishes when Nathan quietly opened the closet and draped a light blanket over my shoulders from behind. He didn't ask if I was cold. He didn't wait for a thank you. He simply noticed a need and answered it. As naturally as breathing, I turned to look at him, and in his eyes there was no expectation, no demand. Only the steady and gentle presence of someone who loves not with loud declarations but with mature, grounded devotion, something I never knew I was allowed to receive. On mornings when Nathan made coffee, he always handed me the first cup, even though he had been up longer. When I forgot my coat in the rush to get Ellie to school, he quietly slipped his jacket over my shoulders without a word. Once, I asked him why he never said things like, "I love you," or "I'll always be here." He smiled and replied, slowly and softly, "Because if something has to be spoken in order to be believed, then maybe it's not strong enough to last." And he was right. I had heard those promises before from Blake. Beautiful words, pledges of forever, oaths of protection, declarations that he would never hurt me, but he was the first to break me. Nathan, on the other hand, never asked me to believe him. And yet, he's the one I trust most. Because love isn't made up of rehearsed lines spoken at the right time. It's made in the way someone lives beside you, quietly, patiently, with reverence. Ellie has begun to sense it too. One afternoon, she fell at the playground and didn't cry out for me like she used to. She ran straight to Nathan, wrapped her arms around his legs, sobbing. Nathan bent down, scooped her up, wiped her tears, and asked if it hurt. He didn't scold her for being clumsy. He didn't frighten her with blame. I watched the scene unfold in silence. Moments like that can't be faked. They can't be staged. They can only come from a place of real feeling. We didn't throw a party when the worst was behind us. We didn't splurge on things or post our journey online. The new life came quietly, like a spring breeze slipping in through an open window, carrying the scent of something gentle and true. One day, while Nathan sat in the armchair reading and I folded laundry nearby, he looked up and stared at me for a long moment. I asked what was wrong. He shook his head, smiled, and said he was trying to memorize that moment. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it was ordinary. And he didn't want to forget it. I didn't reply, but my heart clenched in that warm, grateful way that tells you someone sees the same future you do. Because the man in front of me had chosen to attach himself not to high drama or grand gestures, but to the quiet, simple days we had once only dreamed of. And I understood then that we didn't need rings or aisles or vows spoken before witnesses. Nathan had already made his promise to me in his own way, through presence, through consistency, through the way he looked at me like every moment mattered, even the ones that seemed small. It was a vow with no words, a silent promise, stronger and more enduring than anything I had ever known. Not everyone gets the chance to choose a new ending. But sometimes, after all the upheaval, life quietly offers us a different kind of closure, gentler, more complete, and truer to the person we've bravely become. For Nathan and me, our ending didn't arrive with a grand event or a dramatic climax. It came through the small, honest moments. It came from his choice to stay, and my choice to stop running. We are no longer two people carrying fractured pasts. We are two souls who have learned to mend what was broken, through trust, through kindness, and through a love that asks for nothing in return. And Ellie, the little girl who once saw her mother tremble in silence, now grows up in a home filled with laughter, with someone who listens, and with arms always ready to hold her when she feels fragile. This story is not just about fear, or violence, or the past. It is a story of hope, of healing, and of how a woman, even after falling hard, can still rise stronger, braver, and capable of finding a happiness that honors her heart. It's also a gentle reminder for all of us that there is no easy road to inner freedom, but if we are patient, and if we walk alongside someone who truly stays, even a life once shattered can be rearranged through love and compassion. If you're watching this video and see yourself somewhere in this story, please remember you are not alone. And if you feel comfortable, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. How did this story speak to you? Did it bring to mind something in your own life? We would be honored to hear the most genuine feelings from your heart. And if you find meaning in stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the Dear Single Mom YouTube channel, click like, and share it with someone who might need it. Here, we are telling stories, listening, and healing together. Thank you for giving us your precious time and walking with us to the very end. May you always have good health, joyful days, and peace in your soul. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you in the next video from Dear Single Mom.